Welcome to Film Summary. Today I am going to explain a movie called Black Sheep, 2006. The film starts from a farm in New Zealand. Three young boys, brothers Angus, Henry Oldfield, and Tucker are rounding up sheep. Henry is very good at sheep farming, so his father is proud of him. But Angus looking jealous to see him, who wears a leg brace and walks with a limp. The next day he kills Henry's pet sheep Dudley, when Henry arrived at his sheep farm and sees his sheep is missing, so he starts to find him, but his brother terrifies him by dressing up in the dead sheep's carcass. This torture is interrupted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Mack, telling them that their father has died in an accident. 15 years later, an adult Henry takes a taxi to the farm. His traumatic experience has left him with a terrible fear of sheep. After this, when he arrived at his home he meets Mrs. Mack. She sees Henry and becomes very happy. And then Henry decided to meet with his brother. When Angus sees his brother and he tells him, "What are you doing here?" Henry says that our family has been here for over 100 years, and I spent my first 10 years here, and now my therapist called me here, but Angus makes fun of him. Meanwhile, two animal rights activists, Grant and a young woman called Experience, sneak into the farm to take photos of a research laboratory. Grant impulsively steals a container of waste and runs off. The team of scientists also runs to catch Grant, but Grant and his partner hides in the forest, and his partner asks to Grant that what is this? Grant says this is the proof of experiment these scientists is doing something bad experiment. When the team of scientists reaches there, Grant runs off and leaves his partner alone, then Grant trips and breaks the container. A small but feisty sheep fetus emerges and bites him in his ear. Angus, now a gentleman farmer, when he meets Henry and gives him a check for $2 million to buy him out of his farm. Henry is about to leave, but Mrs. Mack insists he takes a run up to the top of the farm with Tucker to help him get closure over his father's death. And then we see a feisty sheep fetus crawls off and bites an adult sheep. Henry and Tucker drive up the hill, but their way is blocked by a sheep with a bite on its nose. They get out to deal with the sheep. Experience sneaks up and grabs the rifle from the truck, demanding to know where Grant is. Meanwhile in the woods, vegetarian Grant has developed a sudden appetite for meat and rips the throat out of a fluffy gray bunny. A farm worker is cooking up a feed in his shed and reading a history of New Zealand, but is interrupted by a noise outside. When he goes out to investigate, he is killed. Tucker easily disarms Experience. He and Henry give her a ride in the truck. They see smoke coming from a farm worker's shed. Going to investigate, they are confronted by a killer sheep. They lock the door, but the sheep tries to break in. Henry's sheep phobia kicks in big time. Experience tells them the sheep have been affected by Angus's genetic engineering program. The sheep headbutts through the wooden door, and Tucker kills it with a couple of headshots from his rifle. Henry, Tucker, and Experience try to escape in the truck, but a sheep jumps into the cab and attacks Tucker, biting through his gumboot. He jumps into the back of the truck, leaving the sheep at the wheel. The trio jump off the back as the truck goes over the cliff and ends up shattered on a beach below. It is revealed that this is where Henry's father fell to his death. They decide to make a run for the car back at the farmhouse, but have a long way to travel. At the research lab, the killer sheep attack and kill the lab assistants. Grant, obviously suffering from the sheep fetus bite, is wandering the hills and encounters Angus, who is driving up to the research lab. A confrontation over Angus's animal research ends with Grant biting Angus on the hand and running off. As Henry, Experience, and Tucker walk down the hill, Tucker takes off his gumboot and discovers that his sheep-bitten foot is turned into a sheep's hoof. A large pack of sheep attacks them and they take shelter in the research lab. Inside the lab, they find an opened-up sheep, still alive, suspended from the ceiling. They are confronted by the head scientist Dr. Rush, her assistant, and Angus. Tucker holds Angus at gunpoint, but Dr. Rush blindsides him by injecting him with a paralyzing drug. Henry and Experience run out of the building and try to escape the herd of killer sheep by entering a fenced-off area around an offal pit. Angus follows them and expresses his scorn at Henry's fear of sheep. The sheep do not attack Angus. A sheep startles Henry, and he falls into the awful pit, dragging Experience with him. Fortunately, she has an aromatherapy candle with her for light, and they make their way through a system of caves that leads back to the Woolshed. Back at the lab, Angus talks soothingly to his prize sheep. Grant's bite on his hand looks rather infected. Angus's assistants have been torn apart and are being eaten by the killer sheep. Inside the lab, Dr. Rush sees Tucker's sheep foot and enthuses about the spontaneous cellular transfer. Angus tells her to stay in the lab while he presents his new sheep to the public. Dr. Rush resentfully implies that Angus's interest in the sheep has been rather personal. Down in the caves, a killer sheep is heard chasing Henry and Experience down the tunnel. Henry uses Experience's chakra meditation techniques to calm her down. They manage to climb out of the cave, with a sheep biting at Henry's foot. They set fire to the sheep with the candle. It burns rather well. Henry and Experience emerge from the cave near the Woolshed. They hear someone cheering inside. It turns out to be Grant, who has transformed into a 7-foot-tall were-sheep and is trying to shear himself. The were-sheep is remarkably strong, flinging Henry across the room with one blow. Henry tries to cut its throat with a shearing comb, but fails. They flee using the Woolshed gates to slow the were-sheep down. Experience scolds were-sheep Grant for eating meat, and he looks guilty for a moment, but resumes his attack. In the lab, Dr. Rush plans to use the amniotic fluid from an artificial sheep womb as a vaccine to transform Tucker's sheep foot back into human form. Before she has a chance to inject him, he starts to undergo a violent transformation into a were-sheep. The vaccine restores him almost instantly to human form. Dr. Rush takes off to give Angus a shot of the vaccine, leaving Tucker tied to a bench. Outside the lab, Dr. Rush is attacked by sheep, flees through the trees, but is caught and killed by one. Angus is presenting his new sheep breed to an audience of international investors, but he is losing his composure as the sheep genes take over. When he uncrates the Oldfield sheep, it calls out to all the other sheep on the farm. A rumbling is heard as masses of sheep head straight for the gathering. The sheep start ripping out the throats, lips, and guts of the crowd. They leave Angus alone though, and he realizes that his bitten hand has turned into a hoof. Mrs. Mack turns up in her Morris 1300 and rescues Henry and Experience. They go into the house to try to phone for help, but were-sheep Grant finds them and attacks. They distract him with Mrs. Mack's haggis, while Henry fetches a shotgun, but the were-sheep overpowers him. Hippie Girl paralyzes the were-sheep with a needle and an acupuncture point. Night falls and the sheep surround the house. Henry finds Angus upstairs, who is standing in his room with his favorite sheep. Henry says that's a pretty bad idea of animal husbandry. Angus reveals that the sheep were genetically engineered using the Oldfield family DNA. The sheep break into the house. Henry takes his father's Golden Shears Award statuette and exits. Outside, everyone bitten by the sheep is turning into a were-sheep. Angus walks unharmed through the sheep to the barn to escape on his plane. Henry realizes he has been bitten by Grant. Henry says goodbye to Experience with a kiss. He dresses up in sheepskin and crawls through the mob, but an amorous sheep blows his cover. However, the sheep do not attack him because he has been infected. Mrs. Mack and Experience escape in the car, with Experience blowing away a few sheep with headshots from the shotgun. Angus, intending to escape in his biplane, starts the plane's engine, but then begins the were-sheep transformation before he can board. Henry finds him in his transformed state. Angus attacks him. Henry stabs him with the golden shears. It appears Angus is dying, but then he transforms into a full were-sheep and resumes his attack. Meanwhile, the biplane has started moving around the field. Henry discovers that were-sheep can be controlled by a sheepdog and holds Angus in position so that the biplane's propeller can slice and dice him. This does not quite kill Angus, but then Tucker shows up with the sheep amniotic fluid vaccine in a drenching gun and cures both Henry and Angus. They use sheepdogs to round up the killer sheep and were-sheep, but they do not have enough amniotic drench to deal with them all. Angus, now in maimed human form, offers himself up to the assembled sheep, who tear him apart. The sheep are farting copiously, and Henry realizes the inflammable methane can be used to blow up the entire mob of sheep, and throws a lighter at them. Big sheepy explosion. After this, Henry and Tucker drench the final were sheep. It turns out to be Grant, who is mortified that he's eaten a rabbit. Mrs. Mack turns up with a snack of mountain oysters. Experience eats one thinking it to be seafood, and much hilarity ensues. Upon the hillside, a sheepdog, surveying the scene, suddenly lets out a baa. The movie ends here. Subscribe to this channel for more interesting videos. Thanks for watching.